All right, everyone, this is Dr. Robertson. Hello. I want to give you a little bit of instruction on rhetorical theory. Now, this is just going to be a primer. This is the bare basics of rhetorical theory. Rhetorical theory is big, covers a lot of stuff. I'm just going to give you a bit of an introduction so that you can use this information, use this course of study as you go through and draft and compose your opinion essay. We're going to come back to rhetorical theory after we do the review and we do a rhetorical analysis. And rhetorical theory can be used for both. Rhetorical theory can be used for analysis, which is when you break something down into its parts and you look at the parts and try to figure out how they work together, right? But it can also be used for what we call invention, when you're inventing an argument or trying to figure out something to say. But before we go into that, we first got to start out understanding what an argument actually is. In our culture, we have a tendency to think of argument as negative. It carries negative connotations. So keep in mind that all words have both a denotation. Denotation means the dictionary definition of the word. And all words have a connotation. And that connotation is either going to be positive, negative, or neutral. An example of a neutral connotation would be inexpensive. Inexpensive has kind of neutral, we can even say neutral good connotations to it. But it means that something doesn't cost a lot of money. If we wanted to make that have positive connotations, we might say that it was the choice to buy it was thrifty. Thrifty has positive connotations about saving money, about being wise with your money. If we wanted to use negative connotations, we might use cheap or stingy. Those words have negative connotations about the use of money. So this is an example of connotation and denotation. The connotation of the word argument tends to be, when we use the word argument, we kind of tend to mean that we're quarreling, we're fighting, we're debating in a negative sense. Don't argue with me. That means we're disagreeing about something or contradicting somebody or being kind of purposefully obtuse in the way that we're engaging with other people. But that's not actually what the word argument means. That's not its denotation. Okay? We use arguments all the time. Movies make arguments. Poems make arguments. The way you dress is an argument about, to some degree or another, your identity, maybe even how much money you have, the car you drive sends a message about you, whether or not you have tattoos. All of these things send messages. All of them are arguments. So to some degree, an argument is any time you are sending a message, you're making a claim and trying to support it with evidence or with reasons. And these arguments show up all over the place. Now, two words that we often use as stand-ins for argument are conversation and debate. We also use quarrel, but quarrel or a fight, antagonism, contention, these words have a tendency to, these tend to be the connotations that the word argument carries. The word conversation doesn't usually carry the connotation of fighting or even arguing, but arguments happen during conversations all the time and not in a negative sense. Whereas debates are actually competitive attempts to make one argument win over the other. So when we're having conversations tend to be informal. There are formal conversations. You got to have formal conversations. Academic conversations are formal conversations. But by and large, conversations are informal and they are non-competitive. So when we're in a conversation with another person, we're trying to connect with them and not necessarily compete with them. Conversation is not about winning, it's about connecting. And so when we argue or make an argument within the context of a conversation, Generally speaking, what we're trying to do is clarify some thought we had or a feeling that we had. Think about the fact that we'll look at the most recent Superman movie. I didn't really like it that much. It wasn't horrible. It was competently made, but I don't think it was a great movie. And I think there are other Superman movies that are better than that. A friend of mine and I could have a conversation in which we agree that the 2025 Superman movie wasn't very good, but we would both potentially make different arguments about why it wasn't good. So I might argue on the comparatively, right? That in comparison to other Superman movies, 2025 Superman wasn't as epic. The acting wasn't as good. The character development wasn't as good. The directing wasn't as good. Somebody else might say it wasn't as good because maybe it felt like a TV show, right? It was less cinematic and it was more episodic. Or maybe they would say that, it just felt too much like a James Gunn movie and not like a Superman movie. Notice that in this conversation, we're agreeing, but we're offering different reasons for the same conclusion. That's an argument. Just offering reasons for your conclusion or for your position, that's argument. That's really all argument is. You have a position, you offer reasons for it. Now, if my friend and I disagreed, if he really liked it and I didn't really like it, we would still offer reasons for our positions, but we would do it in a conversation in a clarifying manner. He may try to convince me that it's a good movie, and I may try to convince him that it's not a good movie. We'll get into persuasion here in a minute, but it's friendly, it's non combative, non contentious, informal, non competitive. That's argument within the context of conversation. Debates are different. Generally speaking, debates are formal. There are informal debates, but generally speaking, a debate is going to be formal. What that means is that there are rules. So you flip a coin, decide who goes first. The first person lays out their argument, so their position and all the reasons that they hold it, maybe address some counter arguments and have a little conclusion. Then the next person has a few moments to rebut, and then they present their position and all of their reasons for that position, and then the other person, the first person, will have a chance to rebut. There might be a Q&A session at the end where audience members are trying to put their 2 bits in, and then each one will have an opportunity to sum up. In a debate, the debaters are not trying to convince one another. The debaters are trying to convince the audience that theirs is the most reasonable argument. So the problem with arguments and conversations is when conversations turn into debates, when one of you is trying to win over the other. And a great way to calm that down is to just take a step back and say, I don't want to debate this. I'm just saying I have reason to believe what I believe. And isn't my position kind of reasonable? I mean, haven't I posited that my position is reasonable? So debates and conversations, they are not necessarily forms of argument, or they are not synonyms for argument. They are situations in which arguments often arise. But an argument is not necessarily contradiction. Just because you're disagreeing doesn't mean you're having an argument. Same is true of contention. Arguments can be contention-free. Arguments can be contentious. Arguments can be competitive. Arguments can be non-competitive. The key thing to get here is that an argument is nothing more than a position or a conclusion supported by reasons and evidence. You're simply taking a position and you're giving your reasons for that position. So, argument. All an argument is an intellectual position or an intellectual conclusion that is supported with reasons and evidence. That's it. That's an argument. Every time you do that, every time you try to say, hey, I have this position, here's my reasoning, you've made an argument. And that's all an argument is. There are 2 basic types of argument. You have a conclusion first argument and a conclusion last argument. What I mean by conclusion first argument is that whatever the question or problem or issue is that you're discussing, as soon as it comes up, you already have a position. Like you already know what your position is on something like abortion maybe, or gun rights. As soon as the issue comes up, as soon as the topic is addressed, you have a position on it. And if you're going to get into a conversation with someone or a debate with someone, you're going to start with your conclusion, and then you are going to offer reasons why you hold that conclusion. Then there's conclusion last arguments. Conclusion last arguments are arguments that were developed through a conscious process of investigation and research in order to arrive at the conclusions. And then the argument is a presentation of the study that you've done. So yes, it's still the same thing as a regular argument. It's a position with reasons, right? But those reasons were arrived at through a process of a conscious process of investigation. Conclusion first reasoning or conclusion first arguments often involve an almost unconscious process of reasoning to arrive at your conclusion. And then you start to reason according to your knee-jerk reaction, your knee-jerk response to the problem. If you're going to do an investigation, or when you do an investigation, whether it's conscious or unconscious, there are a handful of ways that we develop our ideas. One is through analysis. We're going to use all of these over the course of the semester, okay? You are going to analyze, you're going to evaluate, you're going to synthesize, and you're going to invent. For our purposes right now, with the opinion essay, you're primarily going to be focusing on invention. In order to invent an argument, in order to develop an argument, you have to use these other things. Invention is taking the things you've learned through analysis, through evaluation, through synthesis, and then defending them. Defending whatever the conclusions are you've come to through these processes of investigation. Analysis is breaking something down into its constituent parts to see how it fits together. We've got a whole other video on analysis and summary. You can go and watch that video. To evaluate something is to judge its quality. And you'll use both objective and subjective elements to judge something's quality. Think about an evaluation of a cell phone. Cell phones need objectively to do certain things in order to qualify as a cell phone. But then there are these areas where it's preference. An evaluation or a review brings both of those into harmony to make the argument. Got another video on review? Go and watch that video. And then finally, there's synthesis. Synthesis is a kind of analysis where you're casting a very wide net, right? So if I were to argue, for example, that the movie The Lord of the Rings is the greatest fantasy movie of all times, and I wanted to write out my explanation for why that is, there's a little bit of investigation or research that I would have to do in advance. What I'd have to do is I'd have to go and I'd have to watch a bunch of great movies. Like, what are the movies that are considered the greatest movies of all time? I'd have to watch a bunch of those movies and try to figure out what makes a great movie. I might also have to read a little bit of theory to get a sense of, okay, what have other people said about what makes a great film? Then I'd have to watch some fantasy movies, and I'd have to determine what makes good fantasy movies. What are fantasy movies trying to do? And then I'd have to look at bad movies. I'd have to watch a bunch of bad movies and try to figure out what are the qualities of bad movies versus good movies, well-made movies versus poorly made movies. And then I'd have to look at those fantasy films, and I'd have to be able to explain why they're so bad. And let me tell you, there's a lot of bad fantasy films out there, okay? A lot. Go watch some fantasy movies from the 70s and the 80s. Most of them are crap. They're just so bad. Once I had done all of that study, I would bring that study to bear on The Lord of the Rings, and I would rewatch The Lord of the Rings, analyzing The Lord of the Rings. So I would analyze each of those films. I would analyze the theory that I was reading. I would then analyze The Lord of the Rings within the context of everything I had learned from all of that other stuff. And then I would synthesize what I had learned. I'd bring it all together to develop my argument for why The Lord of the Rings is the greatest fantasy film of all time. All of those strategies would help me invent my argument about The Lord of the Rings. So this is how essentially argument works, okay? In order to be a good arguer, you first have to be a good critical thinker. You have to be able to look at things with a critical eye. One way to think about the relationship between critical thinking and argument is that critical thinking is what gives an argument life. It's what allows you to argue. Whereas an argument is a vehicle for your critical thinking. So what's critical thinking? Critical thinking, so the word critical comes from the Greek word critic. We have this word, again, like argument, critic, criticism, critical. They have kind of negative connotations a lot of the time. But all the word critic really means is to be able to make good judgments. A critic is someone who can judge effectively. That's another word that has negative connotations in our culture, is the word judge and judgment. That's partially because of our Christian, the Christian substructure of our civilization. Matthew 7:1, judge not that you be not judged. But I want to disabuse you of this particular connotation. It is good to be able to judge. You have to be able to make good judgments. Kenneth Burke, a philosopher of language, an American philosopher of language, he argued that human beings are born critics. We're all critics. We all come out of the womb having to navigate this very, very dangerous world. We have to figure out or judge who to trust, who not to trust, what to eat, what not to eat. This is really hard. Engaging in good critical thinking, or thinking that helps us make good judgments, is difficult, and it's something you have to mature into. We don't always make good judgments when we're babies. That's why babies put everything in their mouth. But that's also evidence that they're critics. They're testing everything, trying to figure out what's good for them and what's not good for them, what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. Moral philosopher named Jonathan Haidt has argued that human beings come into the world, one element of the criticism we come into the world having is our moral criticism. So we come into the world, according to Haidt and his moral foundations theory, we come into the world primed for morality, primed for judgment. And he says that morality is kind of like a hardware we're born with. This is his analogy. It's like a hardware that we're born with, whereas any given moral framework is the software that we are acculturated into as we mature. So we come out of the womb ready to be critics, ready to make moral judgments, ready to make any kind of judgment. And then our society or our civilization or our culture gives us a framework that cultivates the seeds of morality, that programs the hardware of morality in a particular direction. So the idea that we shouldn't judge, you should judge, you're gonna judge. No matter what, you're gonna judge. Make sure those judgments are good judgments, wise judgments, effective judgments. Rhetorical thinking, or rhetorical theory rather, is one method for analyzing and inventing arguments. It is one way to engage in critical thinking. So you can look at rhetorical theory like a tool. It's a tool for analyzing. It's a tool for inventing. It becomes a tool for training and honing your critical thinking, for making good judgments. Rhetorical theory is focused on figuring out why certain speech acts have the effect they do on people. When you say something, when you do something, when there's a text, when there's a painting, a rhetorical theorist would look at that, the effect that is having on someone, and say, what's happening here? Why is this having that effect? That's what rhetorical theory is focused on. This top triangle right here is usually what we consider rhetorical theory. I've given you this other inverted triangle because I wanted to show you that the audience, so when we talk about ethos, what we're talking about is the writer, the speaker. This is the focus on, if you are inventing an argument, this is the focus on you. If you are analyzing an argument, this is the focus on whoever wrote the argument, whoever invented the argument. How do they establish their credibility? How do they get you to trust them? And there are a variety of appeals. There are a variety of ways to do that I address in a different video. So you'll see a video on ethos, a video on pathos, and a video on logos. So I'm not going to go into detail on those here. The reason I have this inverted triangle is because I want you to understand that an audience also has ethical responsibilities in any speech act, in any relationship. When someone is speaking, the audience, if they are an ethical audience, if you are an ethical reader or an ethical listener, you have responsibilities too. You have to listen with an open mind. You have to be willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. If you have a tendency to get offended easily, you have to rein that in. If you have a knee-jerk skepticism, you have to rein that in. So as a hearer, there are duties and responsibilities incumbent upon you when you listen to what somebody else is saying. Now, you don't listen to someone naively. You still have to engage as an audience member in critical thinking as well, because you don't want to be hoodwinked. You don't want somebody to BS you. You don't want to get swept up in nonsense or in lies or in fallacies. Right? So the audience, as an audience member, you still need to engage in critical thinking. But you also have, this is one of your ethical responsibilities, but you also have to listen with an open mind, and you have to be willing to give any given speaker the benefit of the doubt, at least initially. You have to rein in your tendency to get offended. You have to rein in your tendency to doubt. These are ethical responsibilities of an audience. We, however, are going to focus for Unit 1 of this class, the opinion essay, on how do I establish my ethos? How do I appeal to my audience in such a way that I can get them to trust me? That is something that rhetorical theory focuses on. And there are a handful of ways to do this. Take me, for example. Right now I'm doing this little lecture. I have a doctorate in rhetoric and composition. I've studied this a lot. So I, on this topic, come with a kind of built-in, just because of my credentials, I come with a built-in credibility or authority. But that's not enough. It's not enough that I have a piece of paper that says I know what I'm talking about. I have to look like I know what I'm talking about. And I hope that I do. I mean, I hope that I communicate to you guys that I know what I'm talking about. I know the language. I know this. I'm not reading this from a script. This is all in there somewhere, and it's just got to coming out, right? So this is adopting an authoritative voice. It's not enough to know what you're talking about. You have to sound like you know what you're talking about. That gives credibility. This is another way for a person to establish credibility, by giving a balanced presentation. One of the things you'll notice that I do often is I try to avoid misrepresenting the other side of an argument. Now, I'm not saying I do this perfectly or I do it all the time. I'm not perfect, but I try to do that. And the reason I try to do that is because I want to be an ethical speaker. I want to ensure that the words that I speak are at least oriented toward the truth, even if I'm not right, even if I'm not correct, even if everything I say isn't true because of an error or something in my thinking. I want to make sure that I'm oriented to the truth, that I'm at least trying to be honest. Giving a balanced presentation, making sure I don't misrepresent other people, is another way to do that. And so as you perform these little things, you share a little bit of your background, you adopt an authoritative voice, you try not to misrepresent people, You give yourself a little bit of personality. But as you do this kind of stuff, every little bit increases your credibility with the audience. Now, you can do all of that and still lose credibility with an audience. Think about if you are a progressive Democrat, how likely are you to believe anything that's being said by a conservative Republican, no matter how well he does all of this stuff? Because he's not part of your tribe. And this brings us back to the idea of the audience. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to understand the ethical responsibilities of being an audience member. Just because someone's not part of your tribe doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad person. And yet the polarization in our politics has kind of gotten us to that point. The polarization in our culture has kind of gotten us to that point. My hope is that by studying rhetoric, you'll be able to kind of step back from that a little bit. Nobody's going to be able to do it perfectly, but transcend at least to a degree the tribalism that's kind of settled into our culture. So that's ethos. As you go and start writing your opinion essay, you need to focus on your ethos. How can I get my reader to trust me? What is it about me that makes me a trustworthy speaker or rhetor? I'm going to use that word a lot, rhetor. That means somebody who speaks or writes or creates a speech act, creates a text. What makes me as a rhetor trustworthy on this particular issue, whatever the controversial issue is that you've chosen? As you investigate that, you may not be an expert. That doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have an opinion. What you're going to have to do, though, is you're going to have to figure out something that helps minimize your lack of credibility if you're going to speak on something that you're not authoritative on. There are lots of different ways to do that. If you don't have authority or expertise in a particular thing, think about focusing on some of those other things. Giving a balanced presentation, maybe presenting yourself as an investigator, right? Presenting yourself as somebody who's curious about this, even though you don't know, or presenting yourself as somebody who kind of is just following instinct here. Like, I'm no expert. Just call it out right off the bat, right? I'm no expert on gun rights, but it seems to me that blah, 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 right? So that's one way to minimize the impact of your lack of expertise, is to just own it. Own your lack of expertise. Another way to work around that is thinking about your audience. So let's jump to pathos. When we're talking about pathos, we're talking about the audience. How do you connect with an audience emotionally? How do you engage them? Make sure that they care about what it is you're writing about or talking about. These are called emotional appeals. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. The big one is values. Start with the values you share with your audience. Think about if you're going to write an essay that is pro-choice, how do you talk to people who are pro-life? I mean, that's such a polarizing topic. If you're pro-life, how do you talk to people who are pro-choice? These are such polarizing topics. Well, one way to do it is to figure out, are there any values that you share? That's one way to approach this. There are a couple other ways to engage people emotionally. One is the emotional charge of the terms that you're using. In the same way that almost every word comes with a connotation, either positive, negative, or neutral. Every word comes with an emotional charge that is either positive, negative, or neutral. So think about that emotional charge to your language, right? Does this exacerbate issues? Is this more likely to turn off my audience than help me connect with them? Am I having a debate or am I having a conversation with my reader? All of these things help you think about what's going on with the audience. Who is my audience? What are their values? What values am I trying to build on as I address this particular controversial issue? Here's the thing about human beings. We're emotional creatures, right? We like to think that we hold our ideas for good reason. But generally speaking, what we understand about human beings is that we are emotional creatures. You're much more likely to persuade someone if you are a member of their tribe and can engage them emotionally than offering all of the best reasons in the world for why they should accept your position. This is part of the reason why opinion writing is so emotionally charged, because more often than not, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to connect with people emotionally. This has become a huge problem, however, in contemporary discourse, because often we engage in emotional reasoning and we don't engage in logical reasoning. We just ignore that stuff. Think about how often you get stuck in a debate with someone, an informal debate or an informal conversation with someone. You get stuck on a disagreement, and your temptation is to call them a nasty name or to think that they're bad people. An old scholar named C.S. Lewis, he invented a word for this called bulverism. Bulverism is a complex kind of fallacy in which, rather than addressing the argument, you state that how bad the person is for holding the position they hold, and then spend the rest of the time talking about why it's so bad to be that kind of a person. So you don't actually engage the argument. You don't actually offer a counter argument. You just say, well, you hold that position. You're a bad person for holding it. Let's talk about why you're such a bad person. That's bulverism. It's a very complex form of fallacies because there's multiple fallacies in there. There's equivocation, which means you're jumping between different definitions of terms. You are ad hominem, which is when you criticize the person rather than critiquing an argument. There's a red herring, which means it's a distraction. It doesn't matter if you're a bad person if your argument is sound. You could be the worst person in the world. If your argument is sound, your argument is sound. This is a distraction, but we do it so often. Now that I've pointed it out to you, hopefully you'll start seeing it. But what does this mean for you as an arguer, as a rhetor? What do you need to do? Well, you need to start focusing more on logical appeals. You need to figure out not only if your emotional appeals are ethical or not, you've got to center yourself in reason. And this is the funny thing about human beings is that generally speaking, again, we like to think that we hold our ideas for good reason, but the reality is we often hold our ideas for emotional reasons. And then the logical reasons develop out of that emotional response. So there's an issue, we respond, and then we come up with reasons ad hoc. That means after the fact. We come up with these ad hoc reasons to explain why our emotional reaction was correct. That's conclusion first arguing or conclusion first reasoning. As we move through this class and then into 2010, the research portion of freshman English, what we want you to do is I don't want you to stop reacting emotionally. I want you to temper your emotional reaction with reason. Ask yourself, okay, why did I react that way? I had this reaction. Was it legitimate? Is this an effective reaction? Is it a warranted reaction? So what I want you to start doing is start kind of taking a step back as we move through this class. Now, for right now, for your opinion essay, this is going to be a highly emotionally charged essay, probably. But once we're done with this unit, I want you to start moving towards, okay, let me try to transcend my emotions. Let me try to put my emotions in check. Tame my emotions through reason. In an argument, when you are analyzing an argument in order to see whether or not this argument is reasonable, there are basically four things you need to look at. Are the reasons given sufficient? That means, is there enough reason? Are they typical or acceptable? What we mean by that is, are these reasons the kinds of reasons we would expect in this sort of a situation? We also mean that are they acceptable to the audience, right? What do we mean by acceptable to the audience? Well, if you're trying to convince an atheist that God exists and you use the Bible, that's not going to work. You might as well use the Iliad or Star Wars to convince them that God exists because they don't see the Bible that way. Even if you were to look at the Bible as this is a record of God's dealings with man, so clearly God exists, an atheist could easily just ask, well, how do I know this is a record of God's dealings with man? Let's assume, I might say as an atheist, that the Bible really is a history book and it's not a poem or the bulk of the Bible really is a history book, and it's not a poem like the Iliad is, right? And it's not a work of fiction like Star Wars is. That still doesn't give me any evidence that God's actually talking to people. All it tells me is that those people thought God was talking to them. As an atheist, that's what I would say. This doesn't prove anything. It just proves that ancient people believed God was talking to them. I'm not an atheist, by the way, but you'll note I'm trying to give a balanced presentation. I'm trying to present them fairly. And the reason I'm trying to do that is to get you grounded in this idea of reason. If you're going to be reasonable, not only do you need enough evidence to support your position or enough reasons to support your position, but they need to be reasons that are acceptable to your audience. Now, an audience member can be unethical and just reject every reason you give. We'll get to that a little bit more when we talk about persuasion here in a moment. Okay, so your logical appeals have to be sufficient. That means there needs to be enough of them. They have to be typical. That means acceptable to your reader or your audience. They need to be accurate. What we mean by accurate is accountable to counter argument and accountable to testing. This is imperialism or empiricism, right? Not imperialism, empiricism. This is empiricism. This is how science works. If your ideas are accountable to testing, what that means is that I can look at the same reasons you're presenting. I can look at the same evidence, and I should see how you came to the conclusions that you came to. Accountable to counter arguments means that you've considered alternative interpretations of the evidence. You've considered alternative reasoning and you have good reason to reject it. That's accountability. So when we're talking about accuracy, we're talking about it needs to be testable, it needs to be accountable to counter arguments, and it needs to be what's the other thing I just said? Oh, and it means that your reader or your audience looking at the same evidence can see how you came to your conclusions, okay, and see that they're reasonable. And the last one is relevant. That basically just means don't go off on tangents, don't bring in any irrelevant stuff. This takes us back to something like bulverism, right? If you come to a point where you can't agree with someone and you just suddenly start telling them what they are, what a bad person they are for holding their opinion, and then you spend the rest of the time talking about why holding that opinion is makes them such a bad person, that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant if holding the opinion makes them a bad person. It's irrelevant if they're a bad person with that opinion. Is the opinion, is the argument sound? Is it a reasonable opinion to hold? And if it is, you have to, as an audience member, as an ethical audience member, be willing to admit that. I've been talking a lot about persuasion. This is ultimately the goal. Actually, let me go back here for a second. You'll notice that I really only have three things on here: ethos, pathos, and logos. There are a couple of other things that we should talk about. One at least that I've mentioned already, which is fallacies, right? So you have ethical appeals, emotional appeals, logical appeals, and fallacious appeals. Fallacies are things that sound reasonable but aren't. They're actually a failure of reason. I'm going to do a whole other video on fallacies, so I'm not going to go into that here. But just keep that in mind. I've already mentioned a couple, right? I've mentioned ad hominem. That's when you attack a person rather than critiquing an argument. Bulverism is a complex form of ad hominem, or not a complex form of fallacy. You've got red herring. When you bring in irrelevant information and you want to talk about that, you go off on some other topic and move the argument into something you're more comfortable with, you're stronger arguing about. You'll see this strategy a lot in a lot of good arguers, and if you do it really well, people completely miss it. So you have to be on your toes for that. There's a lot of fallacies. I can't go into all of them here. It would extend the lecture far too long. So I'll do another lecture on that. So that's one of the other things that you need to keep in mind. There are fallacious appeals. The other one is something called kairos. Kairos. Kairos is, so in ancient Greek, there are two kinds of time. There's chronos, which is chronological time, and kairos, which is the opportune moment. When you're writing an opinion essay, especially when you're writing an opinion essay, you want to make sure that you're talking about a timely topic. You'll notice that as you go into read the news, opinion essays are constantly, there's a constant output of opinion essays. Because as new things happen, public intellectuals opine on these new happenings. That's essentially what an opinion essay is. It's a public intellectual putting their ideas on current affairs, putting them out there, putting their ideas out there, and making arguments about current affairs. So kairos is also really important. All right. I've talked a lot about persuasion. I've used that term. I've used the word convince. What is persuasion? Sometimes we have this tendency to think that persuasion is this, if I make all the right moves and I have just the right argument, that you're going to be forced to accept my position. And if you don't, you're just a stupid head. Well, that's not how persuasion works. Persuasion is not magic. It's not like a magic spell that you cast on someone to ensure that they do what you want them to do and think the way that you want them to think. Where persuasion is concerned, probably the best you can hope for is presenting your ideas and showing that you hold your ideas for good reason, that you're a reasonable person. Not necessarily that the other person has to agree that you're right. And that's often where we get off course in our conversations when we're talking to people. We go off course when we try to think, I can see this. Why can't you? You must be an idiot. Let's talk about what an idiot you are. Or I can see this. You can't. You must be evil. Let's talk about what a bad person you are and why you're so bad for not holding my ideas. You'll note that often what happens when we can't persuade the other person to our satisfaction, we rely on fallacies. We almost invariably start insulting. We're going to get to insult. I'm going to say a little something more about insult later on in this lecture. That's not in your best interest. That's not ethical. You don't need to worry about whether or not you persuade someone. It would be nice, particularly the more important you think your position is. If you're talking about a serious moral position, something like abortion or human rights or whether or not we should go to war, if you're talking about something like that, religion, something very, very serious, we often go into preacher mode. We become proselyters. We want to convince the other person that we are right because we want to save them or we want to save the world or whatever it is we're trying to do. Think then about persuasion as reasonableness. If I can persuade you that I hold my ideas for good reason, even if you're unwilling to admit that I hold my ideas for good reason, if I can see that I hold my ideas for good reason, that should be enough. And if it starts getting contentious, one way to approach that is to simply say, hey, well, hold on. You can see I hold my ideas for good reason, though, right? Or is there anything in my reasoning that you think is weak? To avoid the conversation going off on a fallacious tangent, devolving into irrelevancies, draw it back to the argument. If you're in a conversation, this is a great way to prevent a conversation from turning into a debate. In an opinion essay, that should be your goal. Because you're not going to get immediate feedback on an opinion essay. It's a written text. Feedback for public intellectuals, feedback on an opinion essay usually comes with time. And the longer public intellectuals are public intellectuals, the longer they're writing in the public sphere, the more likely it is that they will become familiar with the counter arguments for their positions, and they will anticipate those counter arguments in advance. Let's go back to one of our logical appeals, right? Accountability. Being accountable to counter arguments. This becomes, you become more capable of doing this the more you engage with counter arguments. So you have to actually be able to engage with other people who disagree with you, if you're going to be a rational thinker. Because the more you understand other people's positions, the more capable you're going to be of expressing counter arguments, anticipating counter arguments, and refuting them, or at least responding to them in a reasonable way. So persuasion is not magic. Persuasion, if you're going to persuade someone, the best you can usually hope for is to demonstrate that your positions or your conclusions are reasonable, and you do that through argument. You take a position and you provide your reasons for that argument. And you provide them in a way that emotionally appeals to your reader or to your audience, that logically appeals to your audience, and that ethically appeals to your audience. Persuasion also isn't force. There is no surefire way. I mean, you cannot be guaranteed that your interlocutor, the person you're talking to, or the person that you're writing to, is going to be persuaded by your logic, by your reasoning, by your whether that's emotional reasoning, ethical reasoning, or logical reasoning. You can't be certain, and there's a lot of good reasons why a person might reject your position. They might have different experiences. If they're coming from a different life experience, this may explain their reticence to accept your arguments. You may lack authority on the topic. They may just never come to trust you on the topic. Alternately, they may feel they lack authority on the topic. And so they don't feel comfortable coming to a conclusion on just your reasoning. They want to explore that a little bit more. So their own ignorance of the issue may cause them to be reticent to just be persuaded. They may have ideological commitments that will not allow them to take your position. This is something that we've seen a lot in pro-life arguments over probably the last 20 years. Increasingly, pro-lifers are trying to argue for limitations to abortion based on feminist ideals. Note what this does. This brings us back to an emotional appeal, right? They're trying to build on shared values. What they're doing is they're looking at those commitments that feminists have and saying, okay, how can we turn abortion into a social justice cause? And so a lot of pro-life feminists and pro-life social justice warriors, social activists, they're pro-life progressives. They've begun adopting the language, taking the language of social justice and applying it to abortion. So that's one way they're trying to become more persuasive, is building on shared values by acknowledging the ideological or social commitments of the people they're talking to. Another reason is somebody just may have a reasonable counter position. A lot of the ideas that we hold, particularly the more important an idea becomes. Think about religious ideas or moral ideas. Most of our major public problems, rights talk, for example, the likelihood that we can argue for any of these positions with any degree of certainty is very, very slim, which means there's going to be a lot of reasonable arguments on these topics that contradict each other. What do you do with that? Again, go back to what we've been saying about persuasion. Is your position reasonable based on what we know and what we don't know? Because a lot of people like to think, well, we know these things, but they will ignore all the things we don't know. Based on what we know and the things we don't know, is my position at least reasonable? That's one approach to this. The other approach is to just recognize that people are going to disagree, that there is no certainty on these topics, and we have to allow each other some grace on topics where there is no certainty, on issues where there is no certainty. This is the point at which a truly effective rhetor gets disagreeing parties to work together for a common good. And that's really what the common good is all about. The common good is about bringing people of disparate ideas together and trying to ensure that they can work together to live together in peace despite their differences. The last one I want to talk about is feelings. And what I mean here by feelings is something like intuition. Sometimes, particularly if you don't know a lot about an issue, you're going to have a gut reaction and you're going to be like, I don't know if I buy that. It's not wrong. There's this popular conservative guy named Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro uses this phrase, facts don't care about your feelings. That's what we call a false dichotomy. And I'm not knocking Ben Shapiro here. He's a great arguer. He was trained in argumentation through law. He's very, very good at what he does. So I'm not knocking him. But facts don't care about your feelings. That makes a nice soundbite. But I think more likely what he's trying to say is that reality, what is true, is not influenced by your preferences. I think that's really what he's getting at. What I'm trying to do here is steel man Shapiro. Okay. Steel man is the opposite of straw man. A straw man is when you misrepresent somebody's ideas to make them easier to defeat. A steel man is where you try to present somebody's ideas in the strongest way possible before you reject them. And note that by rephrasing that way, facts don't care about your feelings. It sounds good. It's got a nice little alliteration to it, but sometimes feelings are facts. They just are. Feeling might not be the best word to describe a lot of the experiences that go on inside you. If I shake your hand, you will feel it. We will feel each other, but it's also a fact that we are shaking hands. So feeling is one of those wonky words. It doesn't have a really, really solid definition in every situation. And so that's why I try to steel man what he's saying. What he's really saying is that reality doesn't change based on our preferences, or the truth doesn't change based on our preferences. That's longer. That doesn't fit on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt quite as well. But I think that's what he's getting at. And I would agree with him there that reality is not contingent upon our preferences. But sometimes when you have somebody presents you with a really good knockdown argument, something inside you is just like, I don't know. I don't know about that. Your intuition isn't always right, but it often is. And I would argue that it's right often enough that it should be at least considered. You shouldn't let every decision be made through intuition. You shouldn't let every decision be made through feelings. That's irrational. But completely dismissing your intuition, completely dismissing your feelings is equally irrational. All of these are good reasons to reject an argument. And this is part of the reason why persuasion cannot be forced. You simply can't force someone to accept your ideas. The best you can do is hope that your ideas are reasonable and that your interlocutor, the person you're speaking with, your audience, recognizes that even if they disagree. Good people can disagree on things. Reasonable people can come to completely different conclusions based on almost exactly the same evidence. A good rule of thumb is to remember that for every argument, there's an equal and opposite argument. What I mean by that is that it doesn't matter how strong you think your argument is, some smart person out there is going to be able to develop a counter argument that is equally, if not more, reasonable. We see through a glass darkly. That's St. Paul. We have such limited certainty, such limited knowledge. I could put my hand on this desk and I could claim that this desk is real because I could feel it. And somebody could come along and they could say, yeah, you think you're feeling that, but actually you're living in the matrix. Okay, maybe we are living in a matrix. I need some evidence to support that. But for all intents and purposes, when I touch this desk, it is real to me. And you could touch my desk and it could be real to you. But note that the idea that we are living in a computer simulation, and there are whole areas, there are philosophers who are taking this question very seriously. At least I think they're taking it seriously. They may just be trolling all of us. But notice what just happened there. I'm not 100% certain that even those philosophers who are talking about this are being sincere. They could just be trolling philosophers. Even for something you think is as certain as I'm touching my desk, and so it must be real, someone could come up with a counter argument for that. So just because you have a good argument doesn't mean it's right. It's true. The earth being the center of the universe, great argument until it wasn't. A strong argument doesn't necessarily mean something is morally good. The Nazis came up with a great argument to solve the problem of the Jews, and that was the final solution. It wasn't morally good, but it was a good argument. Rhetoric doesn't particularly concern itself with morality per se. Rhetoric is amoral. Good people and bad people can use it. Rhetoric is a tool to analyze moral arguments and to invent moral arguments, but it is not necessarily the right tool to create morals themselves. Morals, right and wrong, truth, these all transcend language, transcend rhetoric. So rhetoric is a method of critical thinking. It is not necessarily a method of truth finding. It can help in the search for truth by helping us think through our ideas and think through what's logical and rational and irrational, reasonable and not reasonable, but it's not a tool for finding truth. Rhetoricians, rhetors, can be truth oriented or not truth oriented. They can care about the truth or not care about the truth. They can outright lie. But rhetoric's job isn't to tell us what's true. Rhetoric is a method of critical thinking designed to help us analyze and invent arguments. That's what it's good for. So that leads to the opinion essay. In the opinion essay, you are going to be taking on the role of a public intellectual. So you are going to put yourself, you're going to act like you're a public intellectual. This is part of the reason why I want you guys to go and read a bunch of opinion essays. Okay, go read a bunch of opinion editorials. Look at how they work. As you do that, use this right here. This is going to help you navigate opinion essays, because right here, this is basically how opinion essays work. Almost every opinion essay you will ever read has an introduction. It's going to have a body where they present their position, and then they address maybe some counter arguments here or there, and then dismiss them, refute them, and then they're going to have a conclusion. This is basically what that form looks like. Go and use this, have this up, go and read a bunch of opinion essays and see how it follows this form. It may not slavishly follow this form, but it probably does everything I'm showing you here, okay? Basically, an opinion essay is a public intellectual saying, okay, there's this issue, issue X. I think blah, blah, blah about issue X. And I am obviously right for these reasons. Now, often there will be right in here a section where people say, here's what other people have said on issue X. If you want more about that, go and read what I've already done on the classical argument structure. This is kind of a variation on the classical argument structure. What I've got right here, this is kind of sort of the classical argument structure. But I wrote a little essay on the classical argument structure. You can find that in the course materials module. I've done a little video on the classical argument structure. You can go there. Keep in mind that the classical argument, while you can use it to organize an essay, you don't necessarily need to use it to organize an essay or an argument. However, it will tell you everything every good argument should do. All good arguments should do everything that's listed in the classical argument structure. And that's kind of what I got going on here, right? So you've got your introduction, you've got this body where you say, okay, so in the introduction, you say, this is issue X. And this is what I think about issue X. And here's what this is my position on issue X. And here's why I hold this position on issue X. A lot of times it will have a preliminary section, maybe a sentence or two talking about what other people have said about it. But usually it's in the form of your rhetor or your public intellectual interacting with that in order to set up their own ideas. Then they'll have this section. Obviously, there's people who disagree with me and they will say blah, 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 blah. But here's why they're wrong. So here's my refutation of these other people. Another tactic is, people may say, might quote so-and-so to say that I'm wrong. However, they would be misunderstanding so-and-so. What he really meant was blah, 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 and he really agrees with me. Let's say something like, there exists problem, issue, question X. There's this problem that some people believe that the force is real. I do not believe that the force is real. So-and-so said the force is real in this essay, and another person said the force is real in this essay. But I know that the force is just a made-up thing that was invented by George Lucas because I was there when the first Star Wars movie came out. Now, there are going to be some people who disagree with me. There are going to be some people who are going to say that Yoda, the spirit of Yoda, after he died millions of years ago in a distant galaxy, visited George Lucas and revealed to him the true order of the Force and wanted him to write the true order of the Force in a movie called The Star Wars. And then everything that we watch in Star Wars, all of that stuff actually happened in a galaxy far, far away. But people who disagree with me, well, I'm going to say that this is a misrepresentation of what George Lucas has said. Because George Lucas has never said that Yoda appeared to him. He just said he was writing a story and he was making it up. What, are you going to say that every story is true? Why would you believe that a story is true that doesn't claim to be true? Therefore, people who think the Force is real is wrong. And people who think that George Lucas was summoning the spirit of Yoda or inspired by the spirit of Yoda, they're just wrong. They're obviously wrong. And what you should do is just ignore those people who are trying to claim the Force is real. If you want to believe in a religion, go believe in a real religion, or at least a religion that claims it's a real religion and not something that just came out of a fiction book. So I came up with that right off the top of my head. There's an opinion essay. That's how opinion writing works. Note my little thought bubble over here, or my word bubble. You don't have to slavishly follow these steps. They can be arranged in different order. Think of them more as things that should happen. It's the same thing with the classical essay structure. Don't think of it as you have to slavishly follow all of this stuff. Think of it as these are things that need to happen in a good opinion essay. As you start reading opinion essays, you're going to notice that at least one piece of this is usually left out. Not usually, often. And that's going to be the counter argument part. Really, really strong writers won't leave this out. Really effective arguers will always, always anticipate counter arguments. And why is that? Back here again. It's one of our logical appeals. You have to be accountable to counter arguments. So, let me move my little thing here so you guys can see it. So, really good rhetors are always going to address counter arguments. But if something is going to be left out, it's usually going to be the counter argument stage. A lot of people are scared of acknowledging and addressing counter arguments for two reasons. One, they may feel they can't refute it. If you can't refute it, just agree with it and then demonstrate why it doesn't disprove your position or make your position unreasonable. The other reason is they're afraid that by addressing counter arguments, acknowledging counter arguments, they may weaken their own position. This takes us back to ethos. Remember, giving a balanced presentation is good for your ethos. It's a good ethical appeal. It's more likely to make people trust you. If you can present a counter argument and you can refute that counter argument, or at least show why that counter argument does not make your position unreasonable, you increase your ethical appeal, your credibility to your reader. You don't, or to your audience. You don't decrease it. So keep that in mind. Because opinion essays are so short, you're usually looking at 250 to 750 words. I mean, these are short pieces of writing. 750 words is a page and a half, single spaced, 3 pages double spaced. 750 words is not a lot of space. Now, that may sound like a lot to a novice writer, but one of the things you're going to learn over the course of the semester is how to fill space, not just fill the space, but to fill the space with argument. Okay, and as you do that, you start realizing how much more there is to talk about everything you're talking about. You can ply the depths of a single paragraph and turn it into an entire 200-page essay. So this is something to keep in mind. So 3 pages may sound like a lot to you, but in terms of argument, once you start working out how to formulate an argument, how to arrange an argument on the page, and I have another essay or another video lecture on that. So go and watch that one on how to on organization. You start realizing 3 pages is not a lot of space at all, particularly if you're going to defend your ideas. Because of that reason, many public intellectuals shortchange logic and emphasize emotion because they want to be persuasive. This leads them to be insulting. This leads them to use very emotionally charged language, judgments of personality, fallacies. I want you to be careful of that. But in this essay, I'm going to allow it because we're going to be moving from informal to more formal writing. So in this essay, you get a chance to write informally. You can insult, you can be emotional, you can whatever you feel works to make your ideas appear reasonable to your target audience. You're going to have to decide whether or not an insulting, snarky persona is better than a measured, calm persona, a passionate persona, whatever persona you decide to take on. There is one rule of thumb I will give you about insults. I encourage you to insult ideas and not people. When we insult people, we often inadvertently weaken our credibility. It's not the same thing with insulting ideas. You can insult an idea, and sometimes by insulting the idea, you insult the people who hold that idea. You have to be very careful about that. But directly insulting people, think about people right now who don't like President Trump. A lot of times they will insult President Trump and insult the people who voted for President Trump. But who does that persuade? It certainly doesn't persuade the people who like President Trump, and it certainly doesn't persuade President Trump himself. All it persuades are people who already don't like President Trump. We call that preaching to the choir. And when you are preaching to the choir, all you're doing is talk to people who already agree with you, which is fine. If that's the people you want to talk to, that's the people you want to talk to. But of course, those people are going to see your ideas as reasonable. They already agree with you. And even then, they might not see your ideas as reasonable. I personally don't like President Trump, but I am not convinced by people who just knee-jerk insult him. I never find that convincing. Now, part of that is my personality. Part of that's my experience. Part of that is my own approach to argument. So that's my suggestion, okay? Insult ideas, not people. And you're less likely to weaken your credibility to an average audience. All right, what are we doing with this assignment? So now I'm going to go into the actual assignment here. Here are some of the questions that I'm going to have you answer in your expressing an opinion essay. The first thing I want to know when you express your opinion is what is your controversial issue and what is your position on this issue. Then I want to know what speaks to you specifically about this issue. Think about yourself. I want you centered in yourself. I want you thinking about what persuades other people. Why do you hold this position? Why do you specifically hold this position? What is it about this position that makes you think what you do about it, that makes it significant to you? What values do you hold that cause you to take the position that you take? Emotionally, why does your position move you? What is it that makes you emotionally invested in this position? Why do you think your position is credible? I don't want you thinking about other people right now. I want you to think about you. What got you to the point where you hold your position on this? The reason I want you to do this is because by figuring this stuff out, you're going to be able to connect with an audience better. You're going to be able to think, okay, this is what persuaded me. How might that apply to other people? In what way might that apply to other people? Why might that apply to other people? So we're going to get to other people and start focusing on other people in the next draft of this, the drafting an opinion essay. But right now, in your expressing an opinion essay, I want you to consider these questions. That's it. That should prepare you for the writing of the opinion essay, or at least for the beginning of the writing of the opinion essay. If you have any questions, you can message me, go and read the assignment descriptions, and go ahead and get started on this. Hopefully you found this helpful. Keep in mind the stuff that we're talking about here. This really is your introduction to rhetoric, and we will be appealing to rhetorical thinking, this method for critical thinking and for inventing arguments throughout the rest of the class. So I hope you return, if you don't return to this video, I hope you return to the slideshow over and over again. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.